Hello and welcome to Dateline London. The European Union struggles to deal with the immigrant tide from the Mediterranean. Should Britain and France bear some responsibility? Scotland versus England in the UK election, and as Turkey and other countries commemorate the loss of life at Gallipoli 100 years ago, what should we remember of the deaths of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire? My guests today are Marc Roche of Le Soir, Nabila Ramdani, who's a French-Algerian writer, Shafak Timur of the BBC's Turkish service, and David Aronovich of The Times. Very good to see you. Well, in the febrile pre-election atmosphere in Britain, almost anything causes a row, and remarks by the Labour leader Ed Miliband suggesting, at least, that David Cameron's government may not have thought through the consequences of overthrowing Colonel Gaddafi in Libya were described as shameful by some Conservatives. Does Britain and France share some of the blame for the mess in North Africa? How about the EU, and what can be done to try to stop the daily humanitarian catastrophes that are happening there? First of all, Ed Miliband didn't quite say what people thought he was going to say, but there was an implication, some people felt, of pointing blame at David Cameron, and I guess by implication at the French as well. Do you think that's a useful way to pursue this, given the nature of the humanitarian catastrophe?
Well, first of all, I think the first thing to say is that Britain and France share enormous responsibility for the chaos in Libya, and this idea that they could go and bomb a dictator out of Libya and then achieve stability and indeed democracy was absurd. And the brutal truth is that Libya was a far more stable and indeed a far safer place to live in under Gaddafi than it is now.
Not for the people in Benghazi, though, who were threatened with slaughter by Gaddafi at the time. I mean, that was the reason. It was a very difficult decision.
But as we're seeing now,
would agree.
There's no motivation to protect civilian lives. Let's not forget that that was the motivation put out. It soon turned into regime change, and this idea that if you disagree with somebody, you can just, bomb a country into oblivion is just it's against international law.
So you think there is definitely a degree of culpability in those who were involved in trying to get rid of Gaddafi?
Well, absolutely, and as we are seeing at the moment, the consequences are so dreadful, and I think I agree wholeheartedly with what Ed Miliband is saying, but I think he got his timing entirely wrong. He obviously is saying it for election purposes when the world needed a strong dissenting politicians to stand up against this madness back in 2011.
At the time. What do you make of it, Mark?
Well, I agree completely with what you said. Europe has done the minimalist solution. 27 countries having different agenda, economic crisis in the Eurozone, populist movement very strong from Hungary to France. The problem is we see all these migrants as a group, but clearly they are asylum seeker and economic migrants, not exactly the same. We should take the asylum seeker. It's quite clear the people from Eritrea fleeing a dictatorship, the people from Syria fleeing the civil war, some Palestinian fleeing the inferno in Gaza and that sort of thing.
But do you think we could learn something at least from the way that Australia handles this? Which is
certainly not the barbaric way. And we are not Australian. We don't put people in Papua New Guinea in order that. No, we are not.
What about the other bit that they do, which, as I understand it, which is they take people off these boats, they sink the boats, and then they process them, apparently, according to whether they've got the right to be in Australia.
No, they dump them in Papua New Guinea, they dump them in Nauru. That's not the way we Europeans do it. I think we will take some of these people in, and rich nation like Britain should take in. After all, the Chancellor say how successful the economy is, how successful the multiracial societies. Well, then take the migrants here in Britain.
Shafak, where do these migrants come from? Mark is right, isn't he, that it's a very, very mixed bag of people. There's some from Eritrea and others, Palestinians and so on, who are fleeing terrible conditions back home.
Yes, they're definitely so coming from various places, but now as we have the war in Syria, we, as Turkey, as like Jordan, we have totally 3,500,000 migrants inside our borders, and now they are not inside only the camps, but now they are now in big cities, like in Istanbul, like Bursa, like all Western cities in Turkey, for example, changing the whole daily life. They don't have jobs, they can't reach schools. So this flow of massive number of peoples leave our countries in a very difficult situation. While I agree with Nabila, but I also agree with all these NGOs working with the migrants that EU should do more practically on a daily basis to help this burden to be less on Turkey and Jordan.
Do you see Turkey, Jordan, and also Lebanon as well?
Lebanon as well, yeah.
Do you see an argument which says the closer they are to their home means the more likely that they will go back to where they would probably be happiest if there could be peace? So therefore, they should be as close as possible to, in this case, Syria.
Yes, but can you see any solution in Syria in a very short time? I saw many people thinking that in Turkey, they will never ever be back to their countries. Sadly, they think this, they feel that. So I don't know if this distance makes any difference.
David, first of all, do you think it's worthwhile attempting even to apportion blame for this, or should we just get on and try and sort out the situation?
I don't agree with Mark and Nabila about this. We had significant numbers of people trying to cross the Mediterranean before before Libya imploded. A large proportion of them are actually coming from Syria, which is a place where we have notably not intervened and let things run its course, partially because Ed Miliband didn't want us to intervene at the point where Assad was using chemical weapons. So there's a kind of irony in this accusation. And the question is going to be, I mean, of course, the non-policing of Libya is an enormous problem. We can go back if we want to about what would have happened if Gaddafi had stayed and slaughtered people in Benghazi and whether it would have been better or worse. But you could say that an opportunity was given to the Libyan people to make a decision for themselves, and unfortunately it's the militias who've taken that up. But the question now is, what are you going to do? We're not Australia, at least partially, not just because we're not barbarians, and of course Australians will jib a little bit at that description, but because we're not stuck away in a great big island, long thousands of miles away from most other peoples and the sources of the refugees. I mean, at the point where boats go from North Africa to Lampedusa, you're talking about not much more than separates the ports of northern France from southern England.
But then do you see this as a European problem, and therefore the European Union should do more?
It's a European problem.
Italian problem.
It's a European problem in the sense that the Mediterranean is half a European sea, and once you get across a little line in it, you're in Europe rather than somewhere else. It's your problem de facto. It's not just a question of moral responsibility. It's a question of geographical reality, just as it is for Turkey. If Turkey didn't border Syria, it wouldn't have 3.5 million Syrian refugees. If we didn't border North Africa, we wouldn't have all these people. If America was where we are, then America would have them. They have Mexicans and Central Americans, and they have to deal with that.
Final word on this from Nabila.
But also in the case of the resolution to bomb Libya, there were of course other EU countries involved. They were half-hearted, just as the US were. Britain and France mainly drove the war, but they were
but I mean, we have seen in Europe with post-Tito Yugoslavia that when a dictator goes, you get horrible things happen. So to suggest that it's simply the responsibility of outsiders is not true, really, is it? I mean, there's tribal factors, there's all kinds of hatreds going back decades.
Yes, absolutely. But I think in the long term, we should stop bombing sovereign countries. That would be helpful. And in the short term, we must, I'm afraid you make your bed, you make your bed and you lie in it. You have to take great responsibility for the mess we created.
And so you take the refugees
implies,
Okay. On that bit of agreement and disagreement, let's move on. The general election in Scotland is very different from that in England, and attempts by some English politicians to portray the Scottish National Party as crazed left-wingers have gone down very badly north of the border, including some who voted against independence. Are some English politicians playing into the hands of those who seek Scottish independence? I mean, is this just politics as usual, or is this...
No, it's stupid.
Oh.
It's just... honestly, I was away in America for 2 weeks and came back to find that the Tory campaign was now concentrating on this question of Scotland. Most British voters in England have no idea who Nicola Sturgeon is. So you show them a big poster of Nicola Sturgeon and it means nothing to them.
The most dangerous woman in Britain in one of today's papers, the Scottweiler, a ruthless woman. I mean... Yeah,
attempts to kind of popularise it. I mean, I think firstly it means very little to people, and then people. I've seen lots of interviews with people who are very bemused by it. It's a very specific segment of the voters that the Tories are trying to attract, and that is Tory defectors to UKIP who they have to get back in order to have a chance of forming the government. And those are the sorts of people who are worried by those sorts of issues, like English votes for English laws or for English people and so on. It's a very, very narrow segment of the votership, but it is an essential one for the Conservatives. The rest of the voters, which is the vast majority of the voters in England, so let me reassure any Scottish viewers who are watching this, watch it with bemusement. As much bemusement as I'm sure Scottish voters do. Those of us who are Scotophiles and who desperately value the Union watch it with dismay, because, precisely for the reasons you say, because we think it has a negative effect upon a desire to be in the Union in Scotland, and we very much want to maintain it.
Mark, what do you think of it?
Well, I think it's a habit for David Cameron. He tried to go on UKIP, that it's on Europe, on migrants, and now on Scots. You know, Nicolas Sarkozy tried to do exactly the same in 2012, very tight election, and he played the extreme right card like Cameron is doing at the moment. It didn't work. People will always prefer the original to the copy. They will always prefer to vote National Front than vote for a Conservative government that is trying to get their vote playing this card. So I think it is a divisive figure at the moment, Cameron. And for us European, I think the soonest David Miliband comes into power with no referendum in Europe. Ed Miliband, sorry.
Mark meant David Miliband.
He may indeed have meant David Miliband. Now, I'm sorry if I tried to correct.
The soonest, the best.
Oh, is that? Well, if he's got your vote, I'm not entirely sure that will sway many people in the way that you think in this country. But anyway, Nabila, what do you think of our campaign?
Well, I'm afraid when you have politicians and parties who are incapable of winning elections outright, it's always going to be the small parties who benefit. And I have to say the transformation of Nicola Sturgeon from a figure who was all but irrelevant south of the border a few months ago to allegedly the most dangerous woman in Britain is quite remarkable. And everybody thought that UKIP was going to be the most influential minority party, but now it looks as though it's going to be the SNP. And I have to say that the SNP are by no means crazed left-wingers. They have a clear and overriding ambition, the clue is in the party's name, and they are working extremely astutely towards achieving their own nation. And I think that trying to portray them as extremists or even as lunatics is not going to work at all. Yeah, and there I say, I think more than that, Nicola Sturgeon will be in a far stronger position after the general election to push for independence than she was at the time of the referendum.
What do you think of our campaign? I mean, one of the things that's been interesting is this flowering of the smaller parties. We've seen a lot more of them, partly because of the way the debates have been. We've seen a lot more of the Greens, and those of us who don't live in Wales have seen Plaid Cymru a bit more and so on. I mean, are you encouraged by that? Is it quite a good election, or is it a bit depressing?
The rise of the smaller parties, I think, is really interesting because the mainstream ones are accusing them, as Nabila said, like being crazily leftist or like being radicals in the negative sense. But I think, in a way, this makes electorates to just look to those parties, even get interested in them, and maybe start to hear them. And some stuff that the mainstream parties are not advocating are mentioned by these small parties, and they come into the debates, which I find really valuable, actually.
One of the interesting things, David, is the decline in party membership. People just don't join political parties in general. They have been joining the SNP, more than 100,000 members they claim now. The other parties, you're never quite sure how many members there are. Do you think there's a lack of engagement in England which we're not seeing in Scotland, or is there a way? It's a very interesting election because none of us has got a clue how it's going to turn out. But even so, some people just simply won't vote. It was 16 million people, I think, last time who didn't bother.
Well, yeah, firstly, it's always true that there are a proportion of people in democracies who simply can't make up their minds, can't get up in the morning, or are simply just not interested.
Or don't like any of them.
People like us around this table, we are part of a very small minority of highly engaged people. Sometimes it is really depressing. My daughter comes in from where she works and so on. She says, Dad, she says, none of them have the slightest interest in the election or any of the election or any political thing that she cares to mention. It's not part of their lives. As long as the things tick over, etc., then in that case they're going to be relatively unengaged. They might go out to vote, probably will, but not with any high degree of knowledge or enthusiasm or kind of broad, on kind of broad issues. It's when something comes along that really bothers them. And so on. That I mean, I was a school governor at a primary school. We could never get anybody involved in anything, no matter how hard we tried, until there was a real problem about parking, and then they all came to a meeting in order to express their very strong views.
What I find interesting in this campaign is you have a fantastic economic growth, which is the envy of Europe. And the Clinton saying is the economy is stupid who wins election. Well, it doesn't work. And why it doesn't work? Because it's society today that win the election. It's the NHS, it's education, and that sort of problem, which are generally more favourable for Labour.
Do you think that's true?
Well, it's partially because, I don't want to monopolise the discussion, but a little bit of it is because as soon as you say the economy is okay, then Labour's question, which is usually how to spend it rather than how to make it, becomes a better question than to keep on, keep on austerity. And so it's slightly more attractive. I actually think if the economy was slightly more precarious, if the economy was slightly more precarious, it might actually have helped the Tories.
But I wondered if part of that is, we're pleased that the wealth-creating parts of the economy are doing well, but people are asking a slightly different question, which is who's the wealth being created for?
Exactly.
So there's those two questions going on.
And for the first time in Britain, there's a question about the rich. Why are the rich not taxed properly, the non-doms, and all that? It's a complete new agenda.
That is different. I mean, we had the Labour Party for many years saying, we're relaxed about people making a lot of money, and there's a different tone to this election in terms of rich and poor.
Well, I think, in my own view, that the reason why this election is a bit dull is because I don't think Britain has the kind of conviction politicians it used to have in the past, the kind of Margaret Thatcher or indeed Tony Blair. I think there's a lot more consensus on so many issues that it's hard to get genuinely interested in one party or another, and that's what's changed in the political landscape. And that's why when somebody like Nicola Sturgeon, who by the way doesn't believe in Britain, comes in, she's playing a fantastic media game, and to try to portray her as an extremist is wide off the mark. In fact, she's playing a brilliant political game where she's exploiting a system that is currently producing weak governments to get what she wants out of it.
Let's move on, because from Australia and New Zealand to Turkey and across the United Kingdom, people are reflecting on the loss of life at Gallipoli 100 years ago in the First World War. Turkish forces led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, repelled the British-led invasion at great cost. What should we remember, and how should we regard the Pope's comments on the Ottoman Empire's treatment of Armenians, which the Pope called genocide? I mean, obviously that's gone down very badly in Turkey, but maybe you could explain how most Turkish people feel about that, and the fact that certainly many Armenians were slaughtered.
Yes, it's a little bit complicated, maybe like about everything about Turkey, but let's start with the murder of the Armenian journalist back in 2007, Hrant Dink. He was an Armenian journalist. He was running the multilingual weekly newspaper Agos, and he was shot dead in front of his office, broad daylight, by a teenager who is ultra-nationalist. But still the case is ongoing. It's not solved. We have the perpetrators, we have the murderers, but we cannot go further than that. So it's just starting again and again, and the family is still in agony. And many Armenians now living in Turkey, in Istanbul, and people who are supporting them, I mean Turkish people, ordinary people, are saying that Hrant Dink became the +1 over this 1.5 million Armenians who got slaughtered. So this killing made them feel that this massacre, or the genocide, whatever you call it, is still ongoing. Plus, they can't see the recognition of their tragedies and sufferings, what happened in 1915.
Do you think the word genocide clearly matters to some people, but do you think, given the facts are it was horrific, whether we call it a slaughter, mass murder, genocide, does that matter?
It's a really good question, Gavin, because you sort of look at this. I mean, in terms of the definition of genocide, it was a genocide. And the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire went from anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million to what is Turkey, which is a smaller entity today of about 70,000 Armenians and so on. So you can see what the consequences of it were, and up to 1 million people, some people say more, lost their lives. Now, whether it wasn't an industrial holocaust of the kind of the final solution of Jews was supposed to be in Europe, but it certainly was, by modern standards, a genocide. What's difficult about this is that is both the resistance of the word and the use of the word, when actually most people could acknowledge quite a lot of what actually happened. And it begins to be a barrier to people coming to terms with each other. It becomes kind of a symbol of something rather than the thing itself. And I think that we've got to bear in mind, I always say this, it's not that we are all victims, etc. It's that we are all capable, and have been through our histories, of being perpetrators of terrible things against other people. And if you remember that and you bear that in mind, you're more likely to avoid a repetition than if you continuously deny any culpability or any relationship for such crimes.
That's a very interesting thought, because that is also why today's modern Germany, having owned up to what happened, has good relations, say, with the State of Israel. Those two, you know, that is a triumph in a sense of being able to face up to the horrors of your own history.
I really
for the Germans.
don't understand why Turkey is doing an Austria game, saying we didn't do it. You know, do like Germany did, recognize what it goes and take the lesson of it. And I think it's very important in today's world, where Christians in the Middle East feel really threatened by Muslim extremists, that Turkey recognize the Muslim genocide of Christians. And I think it will bring us a lot of good things in terms of reconciliation between religious communities.
Nabila?
Well, I think it's people are often ill-qualified to make sweeping statements about historical blame, and it's actually a very dangerous thing to do as well. I mean, 1915 was a time when the world was exploding and people were massacring each other in huge numbers, and that includes countries like France, Britain, and of course, Germany. And one country's great nationalistic triumph is another country's genocide. And I don't think we're even talking about the truth here, supported by evidence, but interpretations of history. Look at Gallipoli and how it's rightly being commemorated as a great nationalistic triumph, and how Australia has very successfully turned in a military defeat, as it were, into a nationalistic triumph. Now it's very easy to forget that more French and indeed British troops died on the battlefield, and measurably more Ottoman troops, and that's why Gallipoli is a great triumph for the Turks. So this is just an example of how history can actually be anything you want it to be.
It's not a triumph for the Turks, that I know of what happened with the Armenians, you know. It was a genocide.
But a lot of people...
No, I'm sorry. You can't just compare what happened in the Trenton and what happened in the genocide in Armenia. That was a genocide. 1.5 million men, women and children were killed.
But a lot of people would argue, for example, that British Empire troops were slaughtered by their own leaders, including Winston Churchill, who led a disastrous campaign against...
But it wasn't a deliberate...
But the Pope wouldn't be a very popular figure if he said that.
In terms of getting over it and moving on, I mean, presumably there must be a strong tradition in Turkey that would like to do that and can't until somehow the recognition of exactly what happened is passed through.
On part of Armenians or
part of Turkish people? Well, both actually. I mean, the German-Israeli parallel was one that I raised earlier. I mean, there is a good relationship between two states who've got a terribly tortured history, or two peoples that have got a very tortured history.
Actually, I'm sure the mainstream Turkish people are kind of disturbed about this debate on the word. By the way, I think personally it is really, really important to recognize if it is a genocide or not. Just at least on the basis of psychological suffering that the Armenians are still having. That's one thing. I think the mainstream Turkish people, first, they feel with all this debate and cornering the debate on this, recognize the genocide or not, and all the kind of legal stuff that is coming afterwards, they first feel like, oh, it's a very bad thing. Our ancestors should never can do that. So it's a matter of pride for them, actually. That's one psychological level. And all the politicians are playing on this, by the way, taking this discourse. Look at Erdogan, our president, what he's saying. This is a stain that we will never ever can accept. That is what he said about genocide. Of course it's a stain, but the solution comes from recognizing it and solving it. And on the side of Armenians, they are really so little in numbers now in Istanbul. Even that you cannot recognize them in the streets. I don't mean they have some physical appearance, but they, for years, hide their identities in the streets, although they are just among us, live with us, and all the kind of things. So this is also very disturbing for the Armenian community.
Okay, that's it for Dateline London for this week. We'll leave it there. We're back next week at the same time. You can, of course, comment on the programme on Twitter @Gavin Esler. Thanks for watching and goodbye.